I'm Tracy Osborne, and you're listening to the Daring Woman podcast. Imagine the story of a generation being altered by women who were empowered to live their truth and in turn can empower others to live theirs. It's time to rewrite the narrative. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Daring Woman podcast. Okay, so I don't know if I've shared this, but one of my guilty pleasures or secret pleasures, whatever you want to call it, is reading urban fantasy. I have this, I don't know what it is. It's my escapism. I love to read about, paranormal romance and all of that kind of stuff. So we're talking vampires and shifters and gargoyles and dragons and, all kinds of things. So that's my secret guilty pleasure, especially when life gets super, super stressed and I just need to just get away. I will get lost and it's easy for me to read a trilogy in a weekend. That's nothing. Thank God for Kindle Unlimited. Let me tell you, it has saved me so much money on books. But my guest today is an author, and I'm really excited to learn more about her books. It's not quite urban fantasy, but it does go back into, the Middle Ages and, sorcery and all of that. So that's going to be fun to talk about, and I can't wait to learn more. Virginia Stringer is my guest today. And Virginia, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you for having me on Daring Woman podcast. I'm very excited to be here and to share my books and my story with you.
Awesome. Well, talking about your story, let's start there. You have kind of a unique upbringing compared to most of my other guests. Looking at your background here. So I remember my dad grew up in Oregon with no plumbing. They had an outhouse. And, one of the pranks that him and his brothers did one time was to paint the toilet seat of the outhouse just before my grandpa went in there. They didn't sit for a while after that. So you also grew up with no indoor plumbing or electricity, correct?
Correct. I was a child in the 1950s. And so, yeah, okay, fine. I'm 69. Never mind. Let's get past that. But we lived in a small town in Virginia, Matthews, Virginia, which is still near and dear to my heart. And at the time, there were only about a little over 3,000 residents. And it's primarily, at that time, it was primarily a farming and fishing community. And so my parents moved there when I was about 3, moved back there when I was about 3. My dad grew up there. It was my dad's parents. And they had a 112.5 acre farm that was, in fact, a land grant from like the 1600s. So my granddad was the third generation to own the piece of property outright with no mortgage on it ever. We were actually the 5th generation to own it after my granddad and my dad passed away. Unfortunately, we couldn't keep it. But anyway, going back to that, I grew up for 10 years in a farmhouse that was actually built by my grandfather and his father. By hand. They cut down the pine and the oak to fashion the joists, the floor joists, the floorboards, the studs, the lath, the horsehair plaster. The horses on the farm, it was their hair that went in the horsehair plaster. So this was truly a hand-hewn, hand-built 3-story home. And it was built in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and the electricity was only downstairs. And there was no plumbing in the house. There was no heating system. We had a big wood stove in what we call the dining room. And then we had another wood stove in the kitchen that did all of our cooking. And that was the heat for the house. There was no heat upstairs. So in the winter, I put my jammies on behind the wood stove in the dining room where it was nice and warm and toasty. And my grandmother had a brick sitting on the stove getting nice and hot. And she put it in a pan and a bed warmer, literally. And we ran upstairs and she ran it between the sheets, between the, under the feather comforter and the feather bed. And I jumped into a warm, toasty bed, and I stayed warm and toasty all night. And in the morning, I jumped up and ran downstairs as fast as I could to the warm wood stove. So, yeah, so that was my upbringing. And so in the Maagy series, all the idea of chamber pots and that sort of thing, I'm well familiar. And the outhouse, yes, the outhouse. The outhouse. The outhouse sometimes even had soft corn cobs that one could use as toilet paper, and the Sears catalog was always there. So if one ran out of toilet paper, the Sears catalog was always nice and soft.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm not even kidding about that.
I don't doubt that you aren't. Wow. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that experience really gave me a really good lesson and a good upbringing in what's really important in life. You know, when I went to school, I was clean as anybody else. My hair was fine. My teeth were brushed. My clothes were clean. And my food was good. We lived off the land. My grandparents were farmers. My grandmother collected and sold eggs. We had chickens, we had horses and cattle, and we made butter, and she made cheese. And, you know, it was really a lifestyle that really went back to the late 1800s, in fact. You know, they were both born in the 1800s. That's how they were brought up. And so for them, it was just the normal lifestyle. And so what that taught me was a tremendous sense of integrity. My grandfather told me one time, he said, Virginia, let me tell you something. You come into this world and you go out of it with two things only. He said, one of them is your name. The other one is your integrity. And he said, you have to always keep both of them clean and pure. And he said, if you do that, everything else will fall into place. And so that's the lesson. You know, that's what I taught my children. That's the lesson that I always kept close to my heart as I was growing up and going through some of the things I went through, and a divorce, and, you know, a remarriage, and so on and so forth. So, it was a unique way to grow up. That's for sure.
They don't make them like they did back in the 40s anymore. They sure don't. And I'm talking about grandparents. You know, or even, you know, the 40s and before. They were definitely a different breed, for sure.
Yeah, they were born in the late 1880s. Both of my grandparents were born in 1889. My was born in April of 1889, April 12th, in fact, which is my anniversary, our wedding anniversary, my husband and I. It just worked out that was the perfect day for us to get married. It was April 12th, 1980. And that was almost 100 years after my grandparents were born. And my grandparents was October. So, so it was a different lifestyle, and it was a different, it was a whole different way of living, and especially small town living. I think it was wonderful, and I cherish the fact that I grew up in small town America, where people take care of each other. And I think even today, in small town America, people really take care of each other.
They do.
I think it was much to grow up there than to grow up in the city. To grow up poor in a small town is easier than growing up poor in the city is what I'm trying to say, I think.
Sure,
And
sure. Because in the city, you're from the other side of the tracks, and there's usually a huge difference between the poor kids and the not poor kids. Whereas in the small towns, especially those hardworking farm towns, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think really the not so wealthy, and I'm not going with like gutter poor, but not so wealthy kids are the majority.
yeah,
And the well-to-do kids are definitely a minority in those smaller towns.
right. I think the hardworking soul of America kind of people are the small town kids, the small, that appreciate the fact that that they can get a new pair of shoes for school, that they can get, that they can that they can have the things that they need. I mean, there are so many people who don't have what they need, but I won't get off on that.
Right.
But
Right. No, I know what you're saying. Absolutely.
I clearly remember in about third grade, I think it was third grade, I had 2 skirts, 2 shirts, 2 sweaters, 2 pair of knee socks, and 1 pair of shoes. And that got me through the entire school year from September to June. And by the time we got to spring, I was outgrowing the shoes. So as soon as I got off the bus, I ripped the
shoes
off.
Came off, I bet, yeah.
And I walked a mile back all the way down the lanes, the 2 lanes down to my grandparents barefoot.
Right.
So that's why I like to be barefoot now, because I ran around in the fields barefoot all the time behind my
Oh, yeah. I love to buy shoes, but I don't like to wear shoes. How funny is that?
Exactly.
I love to buy shoes. I'm like, oh, those boots are cute. Those tennis shoes are cute. I need to get those. And my late husband would be like, you don't frickin' wear shoes.
Why are you buying them? You don't wear them.
I have a pair of flip-flops by the back door for going out to walk the dogs, and that's about it. And that's just to protect my feet in case I don't see a pile of dog doo out there, So it's I barefoot all year round. So I totally get you on that one. It's funny because when we're talking about this and I'm conjuring up images of Little House on the Prairie, trying to get a picture, or the old classics, of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath, and those kinds of books and stuff. And I'm conjuring up images of that.
Exactly.
But
I just read. I made a decision this summer, and I've been so busy, I haven't gotten to the other 2. But I said I was going to read 3 classics this summer, because I read the classics so long ago, and in truth, I probably didn't actually read them all the way through. Knowing me, knowing how I was in high school, I probably just skipped around and got the high points, and fudged it and got the A's on the test. And
that sounds about like me.
But I said I'm going to read the classics. So one of the first one I started with was To Kill a Mockingbird, and
that's a good one.
Reading that and just I literally was living in that small town. It was so easy for me to be scalped, to just, that was me. And so out of that really came a lot of the experiences that I folded into the Maagy series. And that's why for me it was so easy to write in the long ago, far away land, without any technology, with no guns, with no cars, with no distractions, with no electricity, with no bathrooms indoors, and so on. It was easy for me to go into that mode and be able to write that because I lived it. And a lot of Maagie's experiences mucking stables and learning to milk cows and so on, I know what that was like. And so it, for me, I think writing it gave me a certain amount of validity. It added validity to my upbringing, I think. And the fact that I've tried throughout the series to make honor and integrity one of the overall most important themes in the Maagy series. And so, and again, that goes back to my granddad. So yeah, so I think that's part of, part of the charm of growing up in a small town in the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, back then, honor and integrity, that's all you had for most people. Your word was your bond.
Right.
You didn't need these fancy schmancy contracts. It was, a handshake and done.
No. And nobody sued anybody. If somebody stole a horse from you, you just went and found your horse and you went to the door and you said, "You SOB, you stole my horse, don't do it again, I'm taking him home." And you took the horse home, and that was the end of it.
Exactly. Exactly.
It didn't on. It didn't come to a fist fight. You didn't end up in court for 3 years, losing, your entire farm because you're fighting over the guy next door that stole your horse, and I mean, that's a trivial kind of example, but it's the overall meaning of that.
Absolutely.
And it's a shame we've gotten away from that, really.
Oh yeah, that's a whole different phone call, let me tell you. Holy
yes,
let's not go down that path. Tell us a little bit about the Maagy series.
Okay. The Maagy series is a young adult fiction fantasy series about the coming of age of a young woman. And it's metaphoric, really. The entire series is really metaphoric about the journey that young women take from the time they reach puberty until we shove them out the door and tell them they're adults. And that time period is only about a 5 or 6 year period of time.
Yeah.
So it's a tumultuous path that these young women take. And it doesn't matter what culture you come from, what decade or century you're born into, what religion you practice, what economic level you are. The fact is, every female goes through the same changes and the same development and the same maturation process.
Yep.
And, to be very honest, when I was writing this, my mind didn't connect it. But once I was through it and I was into it really heavily, and people would say, "Well, what's the theme? What's the theme?" And I'm like, I really thought of that when I started writing. It was just a story that's come to my head, and the characters keep talking to me, and I keep writing it down, and I really hadn't thought about it. So when I was forced to really stop and think about what I was writing and think about what the importance was and what the themes are and so on, that just came to be. And I just realized, my gosh, this is the metaphoric journey that all women take with all the trials and tribulations. And, it's a pretty tough road we go on once we hit puberty. When those hormones start to kick in, man, the whole world changes. Everything gets dark and dramatic and scary. And, that's book 2. That's Crispin. Right from the get-go, the very first 5-6 pages of Crispin just throw Maagy and her little 13-year-old self into a whole world of darkness, and everything she always believed in suddenly is not true. Suddenly, people are telling her these things are not real, and these things are not true, and these people you have held to such high standard in your head, they're flawed. It's not real.
Yep.
And this happens when you hit about 12 or 13. Fortunately for Maagy, what she discovers through her journey and her wonderful adventure that she goes on with a complete stranger, what she finds out is that just because you know who somebody really is doesn't make them less magical. And I think that is the overall theme of book 2, Crispin. In book 1, just Maagy, And Maagy, by the way, the name Maagy is spelled Maagy. And early on, I had people say, oh, you need to change the spelling because nobody's going to know. Nobody's going to understand that. Nobody's going to know how to pronounce that. I'm like, okay, so obviously you haven't read the very beginning of the book, because in the very beginning of the book, it explains that the young princess is named Melania Abigail Alice Grace, Maaag. And her father, not wanting to call her by her mother's name, just shortened it all and called her Maagy. Okay. And the four names, of course, Melania is the ancient, the ancient name that goes all the way back to the Greeks. Melania means dark hair. And my daughter is Melanie. Well, Melanie, I was going to name the princess Melanie Abigail Alice Grace, but then I realized Melanie is a 20th century adaptation, and I didn't want to come that far ahead in history.
Sure.
So I used the name Melania. And then Abigail is my granddaughter. Alice is my daughter, the one who's pregnant now, and and Grace is my granddaughter. So yeah, and I folded all their personalities in. Anyway, we first meet Maagy, Princess Maagy, when she's 13 years old in the first book, Just Maagy. We meet her as she's throwing a total temper tantrum at breakfast on her 13th birthday because there's no Spumoni ice cream. And it goes downhill from there. Well, Just Maagy is written in a slightly younger voice because Maagy is young. And don't be fooled by the fact that she's a pretty little blonde princess. She's a raging brat. She has no friends. Nobody likes her. The people in the palace just turn down the other hallway when they see her coming, you know. And but in that first book is really laid all the foreshadowing and the groundwork. The characters are introduced, the conflicts, the questions, the mysteries are all sort of surreptitiously laid in there for the path that Maggie's life takes forward. And so then we get to Crispin, and Crispin's a great holiday adventure. And we've already discussed that one. And then at the end of Crispin, though, by the end of Crispin, Maagy is now 15. And on her 15th birthday, something absolutely terrible happens to her, which just changes her whole life and turns her around completely. And that's where the book ends. Because I love to do that.
Yeah, well, yeah, you don't want to give it away because then nobody's going to want to buy the book because you just told us all about it.
Well, yeah, there you go. And I want you to be hungry for the next book, so I leave each book ends with a cliffhanger.
I hate the cliffhangers.
Yeah.
That's why I always try to find book series that are actually completed because I get so pissed when I get into these. You know, I'll read like 3 books in a series, and all of a sudden I go to get the last book, and it's not written yet. I'm like, oh my God, here I am. I'm in, I have my book boyfriend. I am in love with the characters. I live it when I get into these books. I absolutely just live it, and then, I have to wait. Well, I'm like, come on, people, hurry up and finish writing.
Right. Well, fortunately, there are 4 books in the Maagy series out already. There are 3 more to come. The next one comes out in 2020, which is just a couple of months. So by the time you get to the end of Warrior, Wizard Queen should be out. I'm just saying.
You haven't seen me read yet.
But then, in Enchantment, she really grows up. Enchantment begins on her 16th birthday. And I literally woke up one morning and I sat up in bed, and in my head was, happy birthday, Maagy. It's your 16th birthday.
Aw.
And I'm like, wait a minute, what? I'm still back here in Just Maagy and in Crispin and what? And
no,
so,
she's only 13, dang it.
No, she's 16 suddenly.
Yep,
And
now all of a sudden
yeah, and so I wrote for the entire day. My husband came home at 6:00 that night, and I was still in my pajamas sitting there writing. I don't remember if I even ate lunch. I'm pretty sure I got something to drink, but that was about it for the day. And I wrote the premise for almost the entire book of Enchantment in that one day. Then, of course, it took another year or two to actually get everything in it. But at any given time, I've been writing in 3 books at the same time. Right now, I'm writing in 2 books at the same time. I refuse to address the last one because it ends the series. Finally, I figured out how to end the series. But I really want to get the next 2 out. I really want to get Wizard Queen and Legacy out and published, before I really get in depth into the last one, which is called Last Heir. But yeah, so it's an exciting journey. She becomes, a little bit of a spoiler. She becomes an extremely gifted and powerful warrior queen who finds out that she is the greatest sorceress the world has ever known. And along with that comes a whole lot of trouble.
Right. Awesome. Well, I can't wait to definitely read the series. For those of you who, if you're listening, it's over on the website. If you're listening on the website, just scroll down and I'll have all the links there. If you're listening on one of our syndicate stations, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google Play, whatever, go back over to daringwoman.com/stories and find Virginia's show. It should be one of the first ones there. And then go into that, and those links will be right there. So you can just go and grab the series for yourself and, get lost for a weekend. Go away, take your books, and get lost for a weekend. So, Virginia, thank you so much for coming on. This has been fun. Kind of a time travel.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for having me on. I do have my website, www.justmaagy.com. There's all kinds of fun stuff there. There are profiles of some of the peripheral characters there. Okay. People who are not so well defined in the book, but are always present. So there's a lot of good stuff to find there. And the Maagy series is available in every book-selling outlet worldwide. But I always recommend going to the brick and mortar stores and picking up your copy. Support local businesses and so on. So thank you. Thank you so much for getting the word out for me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Ladies, as always, thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do the show without you. There'd be no reason. So thank you for listening. Don't forget, I'm going to say it like I do every time. Come over and join us on our Facebook group. It is our sanctuary, our safe haven for, whatever you need to talk about. We're there for you. What happens in the group stays in the group. No judgment, no hate, nothing but inspiration, support, and uplifting. So facebook.com/groups/daring woman. We'll see you there, and we'll talk to you next week on the show.